The FBI stormed my sister's wedding just before the vows. They handcuffed the groom at the altar, dragged him out in front of 200 horrified guests, and left my mother sobbing into her champagne flute. I wasn't there. I wasn't invited. I had been cut out of the guest list long before the flowers were ordered. But I watched it all unfold on a grainy phone video from a guest I'd never met. And the best part, the tip that brought the FBI there came from an anonymous source. A woman erased from the picture but not from the truth. I found out while holding a sweating paper plate of potato salad near the lemonade cooler at my aunt's backyard barbecue. It was June, hot enough that the plastic forks bent trying to scoop macaroni, and someone had just put on a George Strait playlist that skipped every third beat. My cousin walked over from the grill, flipped her hair off her shoulders with one hand and held a hot dog in the other, then said like it was obvious, "So are you flying in for Maddie's wedding or just driving up?" I blinked. "What wedding?" She laughed, thinking I was joking. "Oh, come on, Claire, Maddie's finally marrying that guy with the 2 white teeth." I smiled, the kind of smile people give when their insides have gone completely still. Then I mumbled something about checking on the deviled eggs and walked to my car like I wasn't unraveling. I sat inside with the air conditioner blasting against my skin and stared straight ahead. My fingers trembled slightly on the steering wheel. It wasn't just the shock, it was the way no one seemed surprised I didn't know. As if my absence had already been factored in. My name wasn't on the invitation. I hadn't even received a call. And this wasn't some distant cousin ceremony. This was Maddie, my baby sister. The girl I helped raise after our father died in 2010. The girl I taught to drive. The girl I stayed on the phone with the night she thought James was cheating. The same James she was now marrying. I'd driven her to college. I'd sent her money when rent slipped her mind. I'd mailed her a weighted blanket when the panic attacks started. I'd been her first call, her fallback, her person. Until apparently I wasn't. I stayed in that car for nearly 30 minutes, letting the sweat dry on my arms, watching kids shriek near the bounce house like nothing had shifted. I stared down at the paper plate on my lap, the potato salad congealing in the heat, and thought, this is how people disappear. Quietly. Casually. Without a headline. I didn't go back inside. I didn't say goodbye. I drove home with the windows up, the air cold and loud, like maybe it could drown out the growing ache in my chest. That night I didn't sleep. I turned my phone face down and let the silence stretch out beside me like an old friend I hadn't wanted to see again. In the morning I made toast. I fed the cat. And I sat on the floor of my living room with my legs crossed and my breath shallow. Madeline was the baby of the family. She had the dimples, the charm, the golden girl glow that made people lean in. I was the one who made sure the bills got paid and the emergencies got handled. I was the one who didn't need reminding. The dependable one. The invisible one. I waited 2 days before I called our mother. Not because I needed to calm down. I wasn't even angry. I just wanted to hear her say it out loud. That they had planned all of it without me. That it hadn't been a mistake. That it had been a choice. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was smooth and bright, like she had just finished folding a fresh pile of laundry. "Hi, honey. Everything all right?" I kept my voice level. "I just have a quick question. Is Maddie getting married?" A pause. A shift. I could hear the fridge door close. "Well, yes. Next month, actually." I wasn't told. She gave a small laugh. "Oh, Claire, don't be dramatic." That word. Dramatic. The same one she used when I cried at Dad's funeral and she told me to pull myself together. The same one she used when I called after losing my job and she said I was catastrophizing. "Maddie just wanted something small," she continued. "Just family." "I am family." "Yes, but you're always so busy." James's parents were involved, and the venue had limited capacity. "You understand." Number. But I knew better than to say that. "You're not mad, are you?" "I'm not sure what I am." We thought it would be easier this way. Less pressure on everyone. That was it. That was the truth. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been removed. Because I was the easy one to remove. I told her I had to go. She said, "All right, sweetheart," like nothing had fractured. We hung up. I opened my calendar, looked at the weekend of the wedding. Blank. No RSVP, no seat. No roll. I didn't text Maddie. I didn't tell Julia. I didn't post anything. I sat in the quiet and let it settle into me. Not grief. Not rage. Something colder, something more permanent. Like fog that never lifts. No return. It wasn't the first time I'd left without telling anyone. After Dad died in 2010, I'd packed a duffel and moved back home to Elk Grove from San Diego in under 24 hours. One moment I was reviewing a corporate fraud case at the Department of Financial Protection. The next I was standing in my childhood kitchen watching my mother's sturdy calf into a mug she never finished. Maddie was 15, then small for her age, but already loud, already opinionated, already orbiting around her own world with barely a glance at mine. My mother, Nancy, didn't ask me to come home. She didn't need to. It was understood. I was the oldest, the responsible one. The fixer. I cashed out my savings to pay off what was left of the mortgage, took a job with a private firm doing low-level auditing to keep income steady, and kept our little world turning while Maddie finished high school. I cooked. I drove her to debate practice. I sat through 6 college tours and helped her write 3 versions of her application essay. When she got into Sonoma State, I cried harder than she did. When Maddie moved out, I stayed, not because I couldn't leave, but because I didn't know how anymore. By then, Mom had gotten used to me being the one who paid the bills on time and remembered to check the water heater. I told myself I'd leave once Maddie graduated. Then it became once she found a job. Then once she moved out of that weird Craigslist apartment with the moldy tile and the passive-aggressive roommate. Instead, I just kept helping. Rent money, groceries, new tires. Birthday cards with cash tucked inside even when I was scraping through tax season with no sleep. When she had her first panic attack, I drove 3 hours to bring her ginger tea and a weighted blanket. She cried into my lap and said she didn't know what she would do without me. I held her like I used to when she was 5 and terrified of thunderstorms. Then James came along. He showed up at Thanksgiving 3 years ago wearing expensive shoes and a blazer that screamed tech startup energy. He had that practiced kind of charm that makes insecure people feel like they're being seen. Maddie lit up around him in a way that made me nervous. She looked too eager to impress, too willing to laugh at things that weren't funny. But I smiled through dinner, asked polite questions, and took mental notes. After dessert, while everyone else was watching football, I ran his name through a couple of databases I still had access to. What I found wasn't illegal, but it wasn't clean either. 3 LLCs with almost no revenue, all dissolved within 18 months. A change of legal name 2 years prior. Multiple address changes across 2 states. It read like someone trying to stay one step ahead of a paper trail. I waited a few days. I didn't want to overreact. Then I sat Maddie down at a coffee shop in Midtown and told her gently that James didn't seem entirely above board. I didn't accuse, I offered concern. She looked at me like I'd kicked her puppy. "Why are you always trying to ruin things for me?" I blinked. "What are you talking about? You never trust anyone. Just because you work in fraud doesn't mean everyone's a criminal." I said nothing. She shoved her chair back loud enough to make people turn their heads and stormed out. Later that night, Mom called. She didn't ask what had happened. She told me very calmly that if I couldn't be supportive, maybe I should take a step back, that Maddie was happy, that I was making too big a deal out of nothing, that I was being once again dramatic. I stopped bringing it up after that. I still sent birthday gifts. Still forwarded job openings when Maddie said she was thinking about switching roles. Still showed up to Christmas with a bottle of wine and no expectations. But something shifted. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations shorter. I was being managed. I found out later from Julia that Maddie had gotten engaged 6 months ago. There was a post on Facebook, a carefully filtered photo of the 2 of them at sunset, captioned with a quote from a love song. I hadn't seen it. I hadn't looked. When Julia texted to ask if I was surprised, I lied. Told her I'd known for a while. Told her I was fine. Then I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand why I felt more numb than hurt. The truth was I'd been fading out of the picture for a long time. Not because I stopped caring, but because caring too loudly got me labeled difficult. I guess I had finally made it easy for them to forget I was there. I booked the flight on a Tuesday afternoon while sitting at my kitchen table, the same place where I used to write checks for Maddie's tuition and where I once iced my foot after twisting it carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs for my mother. The search engine auto-filled Lihu the second I typed in L. I didn't compare prices. I didn't look for deals. One way, Sacramento to Kauai. Friday morning. Window seat. I didn't tell anyone. Not Julia. Not my manager at the firm, though I submitted the vacation request through the HR portal 5 minutes later. I just closed my laptop, stood up, and started folding clothes into a duffel bag. It wasn't dramatic. It was mechanical. Like brushing your teeth or taking out the trash. I rented a bungalow on the North Shore. Wooden floors, high windows, a small lanai with a view of the ocean. It was perched halfway up a slope thick with palms and hibiscus, the kind of place you only ever see on the cover of retirement brochures or in desktop wallpapers. I had to hike up a gravel path to reach it, which made it feel even more hidden, like the world wouldn't find me unless I wanted it to. The day of my flight, I arrived at the airport 2 hours early. I didn't bring a book. I didn't wear makeup. I wore the same jeans I had pulled weeds in the week before. At security, the agent looked at my ID and asked if I was traveling for business or pleasure. I said neither. On the plane, I took my seat and stared out the window long before we took off. The woman next to me tried to make small talk about the weather. I nodded politely, then closed my eyes. I didn't want kindness. I wanted distance. Somewhere over the Pacific, the clouds broke into endless blue, and I thought about the graduation card Maddie gave me back in college. She had written in silver ink across the inside flap, "You've always been the one I trust the most." I remember she underlined the word trust twice. I kept the card in my desk drawer for years, tucked behind an old keychain and a dead flashlight. Eventually, I threw it out without meaning to. Maybe during a spring cleaning. Maybe when I moved out of the house on Jefferson Drive. Now I wasn't even on the invitation list. Not a name. Not a mention. I wasn't the +1. I wasn't the minus anything. I simply didn't exist. We landed in Lihu just past noon. The air hit me like a warm towel. Soft and heavy and fragrant. Plumeria and salt and something deeper like lava rock after rain. I picked up the rental car, a white hybrid that smelled faintly of coconut sunscreen, and drove north with the windows down, letting the wind mess up my hair. The bungalow was just as advertised. Wooden slats, wide eaves, a hammock on the porch. The host had left a bowl of starfruit and a handwritten note that said, "Welcome, Claire." No one had said that to me in a long time. I took a photo of the bowl and deleted it immediately. That first night, I didn't sleep much. The wind rustled the banana trees like whispers I couldn't understand, and the ocean roared softly in the distance like a pulse too far to feel. I lay in bed watching the ceiling fan spin, thinking about what it meant to be unwanted. Not hated. Not rejected. Just irrelevant. The next morning, I walked down to a small cafe near the beach and ordered an iced Kona with a splash of oat milk. The barista was barefoot and wore a flower behind her ear. She didn't ask where I was from. She just smiled and handed me the drink like we'd known each other for years. I took it to a table near the edge of the deck, looking out over the water. The sky was high and bright. The waves came in slow and steady like a lullaby. I pulled out my phone, opened Instagram, and posted a photo of the ocean from where I sat. No filters, no caption. Just the view. A chair. My coffee. The stretch of blue beyond the wooden railing. Within minutes, the viewer list began to light up. Maddie. Mom. Amber. Even Aunt Lillian. No one messaged, no one commented. But they saw me. Not at the bridal shower. Not at the planning brunch. Not in the lineup of matching robes and hair curlers. But here, in a different time zone. On a different island. Living. And for the first time, I didn't feel erased. I felt quietly, completely, and irreversibly gone. The ocean moved like it had no memory of me. I woke to the sound of soft rain brushing the roof of the bungalow like fingers tracing the edge of a page. It was still early. The light had that washed-out gray tint that came just before sunrise, the kind that made everything feel quiet in a different way. Not empty. Just undecided. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat up slowly listening. No footsteps above or below. No phones buzzing. No one clearing their throat or calling my name from another room. It took me a moment to realize how unfamiliar that was, being alone without feeling alert, being quiet without having to apologize for it. I padded barefoot across the cool wooden floor and made coffee. The cabin had a simple kitchen with a single gas burner and a blue enamel kettle that whistled sharply when the water boiled. I liked the sound. It reminded me of camping trips with Dad when I was little, before everything got so serious. Outside, mist hung low over the ocean like a breath no one had let go. I took my coffee out to the lanai and wrapped myself in an old flannel shirt I had nearly tossed before packing. The chair creaked as I settled in, but it didn't complain. It simply held me. Down the hill the waves rolled in soft and slow. A dog barked once, then stopped. Somewhere in the trees, a bird made a sound like a broken question. Everything else waited. I didn't feel needed. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel erased. I just existed. Later that morning I drove down into Hanalei to get groceries. The woman at the small market greeted me with a knowing nod, like we'd spoken before. Maybe we had. Or maybe she just recognized the look I wore, like a second skin, the one that says, I don't know what I'm looking for, but I know what I'm leaving behind. I bought mangoes, a loaf of crusty bread, some local cheese, and a small jar of something that looked like passion fruit jam. At the counter, the clerk asked if I wanted a bag, and I said no, even though I had nothing to carry the food in. I just held it all close to my chest like it might anchor me. Back at the bungalow, I made lunch slowly, slicing the mango with a dull paring knife, arranging everything on a wooden cutting board like it mattered. I ate on the porch again, legs folded under me, watching a gecko inch its way up the screen. That afternoon, I walked along a trail I'd read about in a dog-eared guidebook left on the cabin's bookshelf. It was short but steep, winding through trees that seemed older than anything I'd ever touched. Halfway up, the trail opened to a view of the coastline that made me stop breathing for a second. Everything was green and blue and endless. I sat on a flat stone and let the breeze dry the sweat on my neck. I didn't take a photo. I didn't want to capture it. I just wanted to be inside it. When I returned to the bungalow, my legs ached in a way I liked. Earned, not inflicted. I made tea and lit a citronella candle and sat in silence, writing in the journal I'd bought the day before. Not anything profound. Just lists. Things I didn't have to do today. Say sorry when I wasn't wrong. Cover for someone else's oversight. Explain why I was upset. Pretend I wasn't upset. Smile on cue. Forgive before I was ready. Be the bridge, the buffer, the translator. Be the one who always called first. Answer. I underlined that last one twice. At sunset, I posted a photo to my story. The shot was simple: the wooden chair on the edge of the lanai, turned slightly away from the camera, facing the sea. No caption. No hashtags. Just the image. I watched the viewer list out of habit more than curiosity. Mom. Maddie. Amber. Rachel. None of them messaged me. But they saw it. They saw where I was. They saw the chair. They saw the sky I was under, even if only for a moment, and that somehow was enough, because I wasn't trying to remind them of me. I was reminding myself I existed outside of them. The wind picked up as darkness fell. I left the windows open and let the air move through the bungalow, touching everything gently. The journal lay open on the table. The last thing I'd written was this: I am not what I gave. I am what I kept. Then I put the pen down, turned off the lights, and let the quiet wrap around me like something earned. The rain came just before dawn, soft and steady, brushing the roof in waves like someone breathing above me. I opened my eyes without knowing why, heart calm but mind already moving. Something had shifted overnight, not dramatically, but like a stone finally tipping after years of pressure. I stayed under the blanket a while, listening to the water and wind, trying to name the feeling. It wasn't dread. It wasn't peace either. It was readiness. By the time I made coffee, the light had gone from gray to silver. The trees outside shimmered with droplets. I sipped slowly, wrapped in my old flannel, and stared out at the ocean. It looked colder today. Not angry, just honest. Unmoved. Like it had known things long before I did. I hadn't opened my laptop since arriving. Not really. I brought it more out of habit than intention. But that morning I carried it to the kitchen table and let it sit closed for a few minutes while I stared at the cover. I remembered the last time I'd used it for something that mattered. Not taxes, not work. Something personal. Something messy. I powered it on. The Wi-Fi took a moment to connect. A weak signal, but enough. I clicked into a buried folder labeled Research 1. My old habit of vague titles like naming it too clearly would make it too real. Inside were subfolders each tagged with variations of J. Whitman, Whitaker LLC Nevada, and Maddie. I'd collected them slowly over a year and a half. Late nights, background checks, court filings, public records. Nothing illegal, but plenty unsettling. Names that didn't match. Addresses that vanished. Companies registered with no assets. Dissolutions without explanation. All of it centered around James Whitaker, my sister's fiancé, who wasn't always James Whitaker. One document stuck with me more than the others. A scanned copy of a driver's license issued to a Jonathan Whitman in Reno, Nevada, dated 8 years ago. The photo was unmistakably James, same jawline. Same freckle near the eye. Same face, just younger and unpolished. That license was attached to a company now dissolved, Whitman Property Holdings, which had been under investigation for suspicious financial activity back in 2017. No charges were ever filed. The case was quietly closed. The file noted cooperative behavior and insufficient evidence. But what mattered wasn't the absence of guilt, it was the pattern. James had changed names, states, businesses. He always landed on his feet. Too clean, too smooth, just slippery enough to stay out of reach. I had flagged it, all connected the dots, and months ago I sent it in a calm, carefully worded email to Maddie. No accusations. No panic. Just concern. She never responded. A few days later, I found out I was blocked. That moment came back to me now, not in anger, but in clarity. I wasn't looking to be right. I wasn't trying to be the hero. I had just been trying to keep her safe. And I'd been shut out for it. I scrolled through the files again, more methodical this time. I opened PDFs. Rechecked document numbers. I added a few new screenshots, links to James's most recent venture in Santa Rosa, a boutique real estate consultancy with no registered staff and a website that had been created 3 weeks before the engagement was announced. Everything lined up. The timeline. The changes. The silence. I didn't pause this time. I opened a new browser tab and created a temporary email using a burner service. I typed slowly, each word deliberate. To Honolulu, field, office at FBI.gov. Subject: suspected identity fraud and financial crimes. Message attached are documents regarding a man operating under the name James Whitaker, currently residing in Santa Rosa, California. I believe this individual may be connected to prior investigations in Nevada and Arizona under the alias Jonathan Whitman. Please see the attached documents for connections to inactive LLCs, suspicious financial activity, and potential fraud. Then I attached the folder, compressed and renamed simply Case Review, no signature, no identifying marks, just the truth. Or at least a trail of it. I hovered over the send button for 3 seconds, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to feel the weight of doing something after years of doing nothing. Then I clicked. It was gone. I sat back, let the laptop screen fade to black, and listened to the sound of rain thinning into mist. No one would know. Not Maddie. Not Mom. Not James. There wouldn't be a call, no confrontation, no dramatic payoff. I didn't need one. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about justice wrapped in applause. It was about refusing to be complicit by standing still. If I had been erased from their lives, then at least I would use the space they left me for something that mattered. I got up and washed the coffee mug. The kettle clicked off by itself. The bungalow creaked once under the shift in breeze. Later that day, I walked barefoot down the muddy path toward the beach, the scent of wet hibiscus thick in the air. I stood ankle-deep in the water for a long time, letting the waves tug gently at my skin, salt stinging a cut I didn't know I had. Behind me, the world I used to manage was unraveling in ways I hadn't yet seen. But ahead of me was open water. And somewhere a new set of hands would hold the truth I'd finally let go. The morning air was heavier than usual, thick with salt and moisture that clung to my skin as I stepped barefoot onto the lanai. The sky was soft gray, not gloomy, just suspended like it hadn't made up its mind yet. I watched the palms sway gently while my coffee brewed, the familiar scent of Kona grounds grounding me more than anything else could. I didn't need to check the date. My body knew what day it was. There was a strange charge in the stillness around me, as if the island itself knew something was unfolding an ocean away. Today was the wedding. No itinerary sat on my fridge, no printed invite tucked into a drawer. No RSVP, no dress options laid out on the bed. Nothing tethered me to that event except memory and blood. I drank my coffee slowly, letting the warmth cut through the heaviness in my chest. I didn't feel sad. That surprised me. I expected bitterness, maybe a tight knot of resentment. But what I felt instead was distance. Clean, wide distance. Like watching a storm behind glass. After breakfast, I pulled on a linen dress and sandals, grabbed my journal, and made the familiar walk into town. The cafe I liked wasn't crowded yet. A few surfers lingered near the bar, chatting over acai bowls and drip coffee, their wet hair streaking their t-shirts. The woman at the counter greeted me with a nod and asked if I wanted my usual. I said yes. I liked that I had a usual. She handed me my mug with a small smile, and I took it to the table by the window, the one with the best view of the cove. The waves below moved with lazy purpose, whitecaps rolling and folding like laundry being shaken out by hand. The sky above them had begun to break open, revealing streaks of muted blue. I opened my journal to a blank page. For a long time I just stared at it. Then I wrote, "Today is my sister's wedding. I am not there. No one expected me to be. But I wonder who notices the gap where I should have stood. I wonder who sees the shape I left behind." I paused, letting the words sit. I thought of the rehearsal dinner I hadn't attended, the family group chats I'd never been added to, the dress, shopping photos that had surely been texted around without my name even coming up. I wasn't just absent. I had been erased cleanly, as if I were a smudge someone had taken the time to wipe away. But the thing about erasing people is that you never really clean the slate. You just shift the silence to another place. I pulled out my phone and took a picture. It wasn't posed. Just the edge of the coffee mug, the page of my journal, the ocean blurred in the background. My shoulder visible in the corner. A still life of someone who had stopped waiting to be invited. No caption, no hashtags. I posted it to my story and set the phone face down on the table. For the next hour, I didn't check who saw it. I just watched the water. A cat walked along the stone wall outside the cafe, tail twitching. A couple argued softly over directions, then laughed and kissed like the argument never happened. Life went on around me with no knowledge of where I wasn't. Eventually, I picked up my phone and looked. Maddie. Mom. Amber. Rachel. 3 of Maddie's college friends I hadn't spoken to in years. They had all seen it. None of them messaged me, no one replied, but I felt the shift, the pause I knew I had created in someone else's day. Not because they missed me, but because I reminded them I was still here. I imagined the wedding already in motion. Maddie in a lace dress, hair swept to one side, bouquet gripped tight in nervous hands. James standing stiffly in a gray suit, his smile too sharp for comfort. My mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue timed perfectly for the videographer. Everything curated. Everything perfect. Except maybe for a single glance toward an empty seat. Maybe no one said anything. Maybe they just felt it. I pictured the photographer arranging family portraits, shifting shoulders, adjusting hems, reminding people to smile. I imagined the click of the shutter and the pause just before it. The moment when someone might notice that there was one less person than expected. Would they think of me? Would they ask where I was? Or would they pretend, as they had for so long, that I was never supposed to be there in the first place? It didn't matter, not really. Because I wasn't there. And I didn't want to be. What I wanted was this. A window seat at a quiet cafe on a small island, a pen in my hand. A truth behind me and a question in their hearts they'd have to sit with longer than any wedding speech. I closed the journal and held it in my lap. The cafe filled slowly around me, the hum of voices, low and warm. A breeze passed through the open doorway and lifted a napkin off the table nearby. I caught it without thinking and handed it back to a woman who thanked me with a surprised smile. I smiled back, the kind of smile that wasn't forced or careful. Just true. I didn't post again that day. I didn't need to. They had already seen what they needed to see. And I had already said everything I needed to say. The wind carried the scent of plumeria through the bungalow's open windows while I folded the light throw blanket across the back of the chair. My journal still sat on the table, page half filled from earlier, but I didn't pick up the pen again. I felt emptied in a way that wasn't hollow. Just settled. Like a drawer that finally closed after years of being jammed open. I moved into the kitchen and started boiling water for tea. The sun was high now, catching on the glass bottles near the sink, scattering broken rainbows on the countertop. The radio played faintly from a speaker I had found buried in the cabinet 2 nights ago, some soft local jazz station without ads or talking. I liked the way it filled space without demanding anything. When the water boiled, I poured it over a sachet of dried lemongrass and ginger. I watched the steam rise, breathing it in with closed eyes. My phone buzzed across the table. Once, then twice. I let it buzz again before walking over and flipping it face up. Julia. Her name lit the screen like a flare. First message, Claire. Oh my God. Second message. Go online. Now. Third message. No joke. CNN, YouTube, anywhere. I stared at the words, my pulse suddenly alert beneath the quiet. Julia wasn't dramatic, not ever. She didn't do hysteria. And if she sent 3 texts back to back with that tone, something had happened. I picked up the phone with both hands and opened YouTube. My homepage was already filled with clips. Breaking news: groom arrested at Santa Rosa wedding, FBI crashes ceremony. Fraud suspect in custody, bride collapses as groom taken away. Mid-vows. I clicked on the longest one, hand steady, though my chest felt like it wasn't breathing. The video opened with a shaky frame of pastel fabric, soft lighting, laughter in the background. Then the camera tilted and everything fractured. Screaming. A bouquet flying out of someone's hand. A wine glass shattering against concrete. Then came the agents. FBI printed bold across their jackets. 3 of them moving in fast, slipping through the aisle like a rip current. They reached James at the altar just as Maddie turned toward him, her mouth half open in what looked like a smile that never made it out. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. The officiant stuttered something, his voice drowned out by gasps and the scraping of chairs. Then the camera caught my mother. She was standing just behind Maddie, hand clutched over her mouth. Her eyes wide. Her body swaying slightly before a guest steadied her. Someone off camera yelled, "Is this part of the ceremony?" It wasn't. James was cuffed in front of everyone. His hands folded calmly as if this was a business meeting. His face blank, not angry, not shocked, just aware. The next clip cut in immediately, this one from a different guest taken from the side. James stood flanked by agents, one reading him his rights. James Whitaker, also known as Jonathan Whitman, and Josh Weller. You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines. You have the right to remain silent. The camera jerked toward Maddie. She was on the ground now, hands buried in her dress, crying into the fabric. Her veil was half off, tangled in her hair. Someone tried to help her up, but she slapped their hand away. In the background, the cake still stood untouched. Pink roses, 4 tiers, toppers glinting under the string lights. It looked like something from a magazine, surreal in its perfection, while the world behind it burned. I watched until the video ended, the anchor cutting in with crisp delivery. Authorities have confirmed that James Whitaker, age 38, had been living under a false identity for over 6 years. He is connected to multiple dissolved shell companies in Arizona and Nevada and is believed to be involved in a broader international finance operation currently under investigation. I sat back in my chair. No anger. No disbelief. Just a long breath out. I had known. Not the scope, not the international details, but the truth in its most essential shape. The kind that hums in your ribs before anyone else hears it. The kind no one wants to believe when it comes from the person who always ruins the party by telling the truth. I closed the laptop and looked out the window. The ocean rolled on unbothered. A white bird cut across the sky, turning once, then disappearing behind the trees. My phone buzzed again. Julia again. Claire, are you okay? I didn't answer. Then another came in. Mom, please call me. When you're ready. And another. Amber, Maddie's not speaking. No one knows what to do. I set the phone down gently. There was nothing I needed to say. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because the thing about truth is once it cracks open, it keeps spilling. It doesn't need you to guide it. It finds its own light. I walked to the porch and sat in the wooden chair. Let the wind touch my face. Let the world keep talking behind a screen. Let silence say everything I already knew. The light came in sharp through the slats of the blinds, warmer than the day before, almost urgent. I sat up slowly, blanket still tangled around my legs, and reached for my phone. It buzzed as soon as my fingers touched the screen, as if it had been waiting for me to open the door. 16 missed calls. 11 voicemails. More than 20 unread texts. I didn't need to look to know who they were from. The names glared back at me one after another. Mom, Aunt Lorraine, Amber, my cousin Lila, even Rachel, who I hadn't heard from since Maddie's college graduation. All of them had something to say now. I stared at the notifications for a long time before opening the first text. It was from my mother. Maddie won't speak to anyone. We're scared, please just call. The next was from Aunt Lorraine. Claire, it's awful. Your sister hasn't gotten out of bed. Your mother's a wreck. I don't know who else to call. We need you. Amber wrote, we don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart. She keeps asking for you. Each message layered over the next like a fresh coat of desperation. They were stacking their panic, hoping it would build a bridge back to me. But the truth was, I wasn't lost. I slipped into jeans and a soft cotton tee, pulled my hair into a loose bun, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The kettle took longer than usual to boil, the flame flickering beneath the small silver base. I waited with my hands wrapped around the counter's edge. When the water finally screamed, I poured it over a tea bag and let it steep. The cup was warm in my palms, but I didn't drink it. I carried it with me outside and sat on the lanai, letting the heat sink into my skin. The ocean shimmered like it hadn't heard a thing. When I felt ready, I tapped the voicemail icon and let the first one play. Claire, it's me. My mother's voice was breathless, shaky. Not her usual composed hum of authority. I don't know how to fix this. Maddie won't talk. She won't come out of her room. Reporters are calling the house. Neighbors keep asking questions. Everything's fallen apart. She paused, and I could hear a door close in the background. I know you're angry. I know you're hurt, but you've always been the strong one. You hold everyone together. And now, without you, everything is broken. She ended the call there, no sign-off. Just a soft exhale before the line cut. I let the second message roll in without pausing. Claire, please. Just call your sister. Or me. Or anyone. We don't know what we're doing. Maddie won't eat. She keeps asking if you've called. I stopped listening after the third. I already knew what the rest would be. Different voices, same tone, same urgency. The same realization too late that something vital had been missing from their world, me. But it wasn't love they had missed. It was the labor. The invisible stitching I had done for years to keep them from falling apart, the phone calls, the lists, the silent sacrifices. The willingness to be the one who understood while no one else had to. I drank the tea slowly. It had cooled, but I didn't mind. I watched a mynah bird hop along the deck rail, its head cocked like it was eavesdropping. After a while, I slipped on my sandals and walked into town. The bakery on the corner was just opening. The woman behind the counter recognized me, nodded without asking, and slid a small brown bag across the counter. Pineapple pastry, still warm. I thanked her quietly and carried it down to the beach, sitting on a bench facing the water. The tide was rising. Small waves broke over the black rock with measured rhythm. Nearby, a little boy tossed a stick into the surf and squealed when his dog brought it back. I took a bite of the pastry and let the sugar and fruit fill my mouth. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing through breakfast to get to someone else's crisis. I pulled out my journal and opened to a blank page. They're calling now. Because the scaffolding they leaned on disappeared. Because I stopped catching what they dropped. But that doesn't mean they see me. Not really. They miss the function, not the person. They miss the silence that made them feel safe. Because it was carrying everything they didn't want to face. I paused and looked up. The sky was wide open blue and endless. A breeze came off the water, tugging softly at the hem of my shirt. Back at home, I imagined doors slamming. Voices rising. My mother pacing the kitchen. Maddie curled into a silence they didn't know how to interpret. And here I was. Whole. Still. Not angry. Not empty. Just no longer available to be their quiet rescue. I didn't call them back. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted them to sit with the absence they had created. It was never revenge. It was simply the cost of making someone disposable. Eventually, someone always notices what was holding everything up, but by then it's usually too late. The stars were still out when I woke, scattered thinly across the early morning sky, like someone had forgotten to sweep them away. I moved quietly through the bungalow, careful not to disturb the silence that had taken days to build. The kettle whistled softly as I watched the water rise, steam curling against the windows. I poured my tea and opened the front door, stepping barefoot onto the lanai just as the horizon began to warm. The ocean was glass. Not a wave in sight, only the slow inhale and exhale of distant tides. I sat in my usual spot, cradling the mug in both hands, and felt that old familiar weight again. Not heaviness, just memory. When I picked up my phone, the screen was already glowing with a new message. Maddie. Her name, once bright with childhood and soft secrets, now felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. I tapped the message open with a practiced breath. I'm sorry, I need you. No punctuation, no greeting, no explanation. Just a sentence shaped like a lifeline tossed too late. I didn't respond. Instead, I slid the phone into the pocket of my robe and stared out at the water. The sun cracked over the edge of the sea, lighting the sky with blush and gold. Birds skimmed low across the surface, wings catching the light like knives. Later, after breakfast, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal. The pages smelled like salt and coffee grounds now. My handwriting had shifted since I arrived, looser, less controlled, more honest. I wrote, now they want my presence to fix what they ignored in my absence. Now they ask for me like I'm a tool, not a person. I flipped back through earlier entries. So many lists. So many moments I'd documented in silence. Their absence. Their choices. Their small dismissals wrapped in smiles. And now a message like that was supposed to unwind it all. I set down the pen and stared out the window, the breeze lifting the edge of the curtain like it was peeking in. Later that afternoon, the phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I let it go to voicemail, then waited before listening. Claire, her voice said, soft but tight, I just don't understand why you're acting like this. If you had told me more clearly what you suspected really made me understand, maybe all of this could have been avoided. Maybe Maddie wouldn't be in this situation. Maybe James wouldn't have been in our lives at all. She paused, then continued, her tone sharpening. You always do this. You hold everything in until it's too late, and then act like everyone should have just known better. Another pause. Then quieter. You've always been a little dramatic. Click. I stared at the screen. Not because of the words, but because of how little they surprised me. Even now, with James in custody and Maddie in pieces, my mother's instinct was still the same. Find someone else to blame. And since James was gone and Maddie was fragile, I was the most familiar place to deposit shame. They weren't looking for understanding. They were looking for containment. Someone to step in, mop up, make it neat again. That had always been my role. Until I stopped auditioning. I walked to the sink and rinsed the teacup from earlier. The water was cold by now. I let it run over my hands longer than necessary. Back in the living room, I turned on the small radio, letting static fill the space before the soft strum of a Hawaiian guitar slid in. I sat on the floor leaning against the couch and stared at the ceiling beams. I thought about the day I drove Dad home from his last appointment, how he had reached over in the car and squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for not letting them forget I was still here." That was the only time he ever said it. And the only time anyone in the family acknowledged what I had been doing all along. I think part of me stayed in that car. In that silence between us, where love didn't have to be dramatic or performative. It just was. And now when the story had collapsed and the flowers had withered and the seating chart was useless, they were all trying to write me back in. But not with accountability. With desperation. That wasn't the same. That wasn't enough. I picked up my journal again and wrote, "They don't want forgiveness. They want relief. They want a version of me who still believes that love means self-erasure. But I'm not her anymore." I paused, tapped the pen against the edge of the page, then added, "I don't hate them. I just don't owe them my healing." The sun had moved across the sky by the time I stood up. I made a fresh pot of tea this time with lavender and mint and sat by the window as the late light spilled across the tile floor. My phone buzzed once more. It was Maddie again. Same thread. Same words, "I need you." Still no apology. Just need. I didn't delete it. But I didn't respond either. Instead, I looked outside at the water, at the light still stretching far beyond anything they could reach. And I chose once again to stay here. Present. Whole. Unclaimed. The morning air felt heavier than usual, the kind of thick quiet that presses on your chest before you even step outside. I moved through the bungalow, slowly, barefoot fingers brushing the edges of furniture I already knew by heart. There was no music playing, no kettle boiling, no messages waiting on my phone. Just the envelope resting neatly on the kitchen table where I'd left it the night before. I had chosen the paper carefully. Pale yellow with soft pink hibiscus designs pressed into the corners, the kind of stationery you'd buy on vacation and forget to use. It felt honest in a way that white paper didn't. A little sentimental but not naive. The envelope was unmarked except for one address. The house on Alder Street. The one with the cracked driveway and the old wind chime that never stopped rattling. I didn't write a return address. I didn't want them writing back. Inside the message was short. "I hope you find peace. I hope you tell the truth. I hope next time the invitation comes before the apology. Claire Donnelly." That was it. No anger, no demand. Just the kind of statement that hung in the air after a door closed gently but completely. I slipped the envelope into my bag, zipped it carefully, and headed out the door. The walk into town was quiet. A few locals waved from porches, a man hosed off his surfboard, and two kids passed me on bikes, their laughter trailing behind like a wind chime in motion. The coffee shop opened early, and the smell of toasted coconut muffins and Kona beans drifted out onto the sidewalk. I ordered a small coffee and added cream at the counter. The barista smiled like he always did, like I was a regular now. "Sending something?" he asked, nodding toward the envelope I hadn't realized I was holding so visibly. I smiled back. Just a letter. One that needed to go exactly where it's going. He didn't ask more. Just handed me a wooden token for cream and wished me a peaceful day. Outside, the red mailbox stood under a jacaranda tree just starting to bloom. I walked to it, slowly paused, and ran a hand across the warm metal. I slid the letter into the slot and waited a second before letting it go. Just one breath, one moment to mark the gesture. Then it was gone. I didn't feel lighter. Not really, but I felt done. At the beach, the tide was rolling and the waves slow and heavy. I sat cross-legged in the sand, the coffee warm between my palms, and watched the line where the water met the sky blur and disappear. A sailboat drifted lazily in the distance. The wind picked up, curling my hair against my cheeks like fingers brushing me back to presence. I thought about how many times I had written things I never sent. Long emails, late-night notes in journals, unsent texts. None of them ever felt right enough to share. But this one had. Because it wasn't written for response. It was written for release. That afternoon, I wandered the small path behind the cove collecting a few stones, a piece of pale green sea glass shaped like a teardrop. I watched two teenage girls try to balance on paddleboards, laughing every time they fell off. Their joy was loud and unfiltered and somehow comforting. I remembered Maddie at 13 braiding her hair while humming the same Taylor Swift song on loop. I remembered her asking me if heartbreak really made your chest hurt, or if that was just something movies made up. I told her the truth, it absolutely could. She didn't believe me then. I wondered if she believed it now. Back at the bungalow, I made tea and pulled out my journal. I didn't write much. Just a few lines. It's strange to be at peace and still carry weight. But it's not mine anymore. It's theirs, it always was. The sun was beginning to dip by the time I changed into jeans and a soft cotton sweater. I tucked a blanket under my arm and walked down to the sand again, the sky streaked with lavender and burnt orange. I found my spot near the rocks where the tide whispered and the wind hummed low through the trees. I lay back on the blanket, the moon already beginning to rise full and round and bright enough to cast shadows. I thought of the letter already on a plane or in a sorting bin somewhere, headed toward a house full of silence and questions. Maybe they'd read it out loud. Maybe they'd pass it around the dinner table in brittle confusion. Or maybe they'd pretend it never arrived at all. It didn't matter, because I knew it existed. And now so did they. I let my eyes close as the sound of the waves pulled me inward. There was no epiphany, no grand revelation, just space, just stillness. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be let back in. I had already let myself out. The day began like most others in Kauai, with the hush of wind slipping through palm leaves and the scent of salt drifting in before my feet touched the floor. I moved slowly, methodically, not because I was tired, but because I no longer rushed anything. The world had made a habit of running without me, and now I had finally stopped trying to catch up. After breakfast, I sat outside with my journal and a cup of pineapple green tea, legs tucked beneath me and the sun warming one shoulder. I hadn't written anything since mailing the letter. There didn't seem to be anything more to say. But something about that morning made me flip to a fresh page anyway. The blankness no longer felt like pressure. It felt like permission. Before I could write, my phone buzzed. I let it sit on the table until the second buzz came, then the third. I reached for it lazily, expecting another round of silence disguised as apology. Instead, it was Julia. Just one line followed by a link. It's out. FBI confirms multi-state laundering scheme. Anonymous evidence triggered everything. I clicked the link not because I needed proof, but because I wanted to see how far the story had traveled. The headline read like fiction. Federal agents crash Santa Rosa wedding to arrest groom in major fraud case. There were photos embedded. Grainy stills from a phone camera. A blurry man in a tuxedo being pulled aside in front of horrified guests. A woman in a pale pink dress sobbing near a ruined cake. A woman who looked too much like my mother being held upright by someone I couldn't place. I scrolled slowly. Not for the spectacle, but for the line I knew would be buried somewhere in the article. Sources confirmed that an anonymous tip supported by financial documents sent directly to federal offices in Honolulu and Sacramento led to the investigation. That was all. No mention of me, no need. I locked my phone and laid it face down beside my tea. Later that afternoon, when the wind picked up and clouds rolled in from the mountains, I walked down to the beach with my journal tucked under my arm. The tide was low again, the waves soft and foamy, and the shore dotted with broken coral. I found a flat rock, set the journal down, and let the breeze flip through the pages on its own. I took a photo from above. The pages open, the sea behind them, the wind in motion. Nothing staged. Nothing filtered. Just a moment that didn't need to be explained. I posted it to my story. No caption. I didn't check who watched it. I didn't need to. By sunset, a voice message arrived. Maddie. I waited hours before listening. I wasn't afraid of what she'd say. I was just aware of what it might pull back up in me. But eventually, with the sky bleeding orange and gold, I tapped play. She started with silence. Then a slow inhale. "I know you sent it," she said. "The letter. The files. All of it." Her voice cracked not with emotion but with effort, like someone learning how to speak truth for the first time. I don't know how I didn't see it before, or maybe I did and didn't want to believe it. I don't know. I'm not here to blame or fix or beg. I just want you to know I saw your post today, the journal, the ocean. You didn't need to write anything. That was the message. No apology. No request. Just acknowledgement. I didn't save it, but I didn't delete it either. I set the phone aside and walked out to the shoreline barefoot. The water was cooler than usual, the wind sharper, but the horizon was clear. I stood there, my feet sinking slowly into the wet sand, and whispered into the air she saw. Not me. Not the version they once leaned on, but the one who left, the one who didn't come back when called. Back at the bungalow, I made soup with leftover rice and carrots. I lit a candle not for ambiance, but because I liked the way the flame flickered when the wind slipped through the cracks in the shutters. I opened my journal and wrote one line. Recognition doesn't need to be public to be real. And I believed it. That night, as I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, the moon rising high and full behind a curtain of clouds, I felt something shift. Not a dramatic moment, not a scream or a break, just a settling. A quiet click in the soul. For so long I had wanted them to say it out loud. That I was right. That I was wronged. That I was missing. But now I realized I didn't need those words. I needed what Maddie had just given me. Not validation, but witness. She didn't need to say thank you, she just needed to stop pretending I hadn't been there all along. And now finally she had. The light arrived before I was fully awake, slipping through the sheer curtain like an old friend who no longer needed to knock. I rose slowly, no alarm, no schedule, just the sound of the tide brushing against the shore like a lullaby played in reverse. I wrapped a sweater around my shoulders and padded barefoot into the small kitchen where the coffee was already halfway brewed. The smell of Kona beans filled the space, warm and grounding. I poured a cup, held it close with both hands, and stepped out to the deck. The morning air held that subtle mix of sea salt and early heat that always made the island feel freshly unwrapped. I took a sip and looked out at the line where ocean met sky. The sun was still low, just beginning to stretch gold across the surface of the water. A couple jogged past on the beach below, their sneakers leaving twin trails behind them. The man waved. The woman smiled. I raised my cup in a silent good morning. They kept going, their laughter lost in the breeze. I sat down on the bench I had come to think of as mine and placed the journal in my lap. I didn't open it right away. I just sat still, letting the day wash over me. There was no news waiting. No one asking when I'd return. No one requesting anything at all. It felt like freedom. But not the kind you chase. The kind you choose. Eventually, I opened the journal and turned to a new page. I wrote only one sentence. I didn't need to go back. I was already home. I read it once slowly and underlined it with a steady hand. This was never about winning. Never about making them regret or pay or see what they refused to see. It was about releasing the weight I had carried on their behalf. The weight of being the one who noticed, the one who warned, the one who was told to quiet down, calm down, be less difficult. All my life I had been their glue, their second mother, their fixer, their shield. And now, for the first time, I wasn't anything for anyone. Except me. I closed the journal and looked out across the water again. The tide was higher, now closer. The light had grown brighter, slipping across the waves in ribbons. Somewhere inland a rooster called out like it was late for something. I smiled. There had been no grand reconciliation. No dramatic phone call or airport scene. Just one message. Just one voice finally naming what had always been true. That I was there. That I mattered. That what I saw wasn't invented or exaggerated or rooted in bitterness. It was real. And now it had been witnessed. I didn't need anything else. The bungalow was still behind me. The journal still in my hands. The coffee half full. Nothing had changed, but everything had. Later that morning, I walked into town. I bought fruit from the same vendor who always threw in an extra banana. I chatted briefly with the barista who asked if I wanted my usual. I sat by the cafe window sipping slowly, watching the rhythm of the town play out in front of me. No one knew who I was. No one needed anything from me, and that in its own quiet way was the most powerful kind of peace. On my way back, I stopped at the beach once more. The bench was empty, the shoreline dotted with shells and footprints. I took out my phone and framed the shot carefully. A single wooden chair facing the water, untouched, sun-kissed still. I posted the photo. No caption. No need. If they saw it, they'd know. And if they didn't, that was fine too. I wasn't haunting the edge of the frame anymore. I had stepped entirely out of it. I walked back to the bungalow and left the door open behind me. Let the wind carry itself through every room. Let the light spill in across the floor. I made another cup of coffee, not because I needed it, but because I could. Then I sat down again, pen in hand, and wrote one final line in my journal. I chose peace, and no one gets to take it from me. If you've ever been the one left off, the invitation, the one who held everything together while no one saw you breaking, the one who stayed quiet so others could feel comfortable, I hope you know this: you are not invisible, you are not wrong for remembering, and you are not alone. If this story feels like a piece of yours too, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment, share your moment, or just let me know you're here. Maybe we're not as alone as we think.